Hello, August. All my Hello Writers Lunch. It is extremely hot and extremely dry here in Houston. So anyone anywhere else, I am jealous of you, unless you're in Dallas where it's 115 degrees and it has not rained at all whatsoever. At least we got that going for us. 105 is not the end of the world. Yes, thank you so much for joining us again. We have a little history today. Playing with the conspiracies, mistakes, and oddities that have created the modern novel. So a little bit of history bouncing around and a clear definition of why everything isn't a conspiracy. Shannon, can I ask, what are we doing next week?
Yeah, we're going to be doing authors pick your poisons, and I'm going to be talking about toxic things in literature. We're going to be going over common poisons you see, mistakes authors make, how to either pick a poison for your particular plot needs, whether you need the poisoner to be caught or whether you don't. And then also how poisons work inside of genre fiction as well. Say fantasy, where the plants aren't the same, people aren't the same, poisons aren't the same.
What was that post the other day where somebody was like, you can make up fantasy versions of anything? And there was this big, long list of like, you can do, the fantasy transportation systems, the plants, the botany, everything.
Yep. Well, we'll go over a little bit of like what makes it good, where authors have gone wrong in that end too. But it's going to be all about poison. So I look forward to giving y'all a dose.
Nice. Heck yeah. All right. I'm going to pop on here and grab this PowerPoint. So you guys let me know if this is showing up okay, if it is full screen, etc. And since this cuts off the chat from my screen, then definitely y'all holler if there's anything that comes up in the chat, or if you have any things along the way that you want to talk about, that you want to bring up, either this reminds you of or all my different parts of history, because you can go on so many different tangents. I'm very happy to talk today about why we write what we write. I'm also trying to move this because it looks like strangely blocking my screen. There we go, up at the top. Okay. So why we write what we write goes back very, very far. But first thing to think of is we were talking about this idea, and we're talking about conspiracies. And I do want to make a cautionary note on what conspiracies are and are not. They're collusive, hidden, organized campaigns to affect cultural, political change, and not to be confused with disorganized or accidental campaigns to affect the world. Many things are called conspiracies that are not. Many real conspiracies take a long time to kind of get digested. So let's look at a couple things that are not writing history that are actual conspiracies. Everything we learned in American, in world history in high school was actually written by German generals captured by the Allies after World War II. When they asked them about the Eastern Front and how the battle with the Soviets went, we let the Germans write their own history. So they minimized their own failures. They blamed the dead guy. They blamed Hitler. It was his fault that we failed. And they exaggerated the size of Soviet armies. And this is in textbooks. This is 80 years of what was written and taught to everybody. Good gosh, the Soviets, are overwhelming and were idiots, and yet they still won. That's because we let the Germans write this. At the same time, the Soviet Union was absolutely faking how amazing their army was and their generals were. It's also not really the case. It wasn't until the fall of the Soviet Union that we got to look in, and scholars reading the original Russian were able to pick out what the actual truth was. So this took like 80 years to get through. Another example of a conspiracy, the Tulsa race riot was not a riot. This was propagated by a teenager, a black teenager, who fell in an elevator, grabbed a white woman's arm. This was also another teenager that he knew, but she shrieked when someone grabbed her arm. This led to a series of misunderstandings that led to him getting arrested, brought to the courthouse. One mob came to take the boy away. Another mob came from the black section of town to defend the court, literally defending the man. It wasn't until 2 years ago that President Biden visiting Tulsa actually acknowledged that this was not a riot. This was actually an attack by one community against another. Another famous conspiracy, let's hide the truth, is George Washington's wooden teeth. Just like chopping down the cherry tree, this is part of the myth making. First president of the United States had dentures, very clearly. But the myth that they were women comes from mythologizing how humble he was. So for about a century, they said, oh, he had wooden teeth. Gets up into the 60s, and they say, oh, no, it was ivory teeth, but they were stained. Here's a picture of it right here. They were stained, and they looked like they had wood grain. They don't look like ivory teeth that were carved, from an elephant's tusk or anything whatsoever. These are human teeth taken out of another human's mouth. And it was George Washington's slaves who happened to, let's say, donate unwillingly to their owner's ability to chew food. It's quite nefarious and quite crazy. And this is a conspiracy that this was covered up, because this is not something that people wanted to talk about. The original president of the United States, who frankly was nearly deified and took a step back from being called king, if I remember correctly. So what is a novel? We're going to look at some conspiracies, some things that brought the novel as we see today about. A prose work of fiction of significant length that depicts the detailed social and personal realities of a place and time period. Almost all novels today also include a central protagonist, a character flaw within them, who overcomes obstacles and triumphs, but also learns something about themselves. So how did it come to be that way? Now, the background of this is that things were lost and found again and again. There are time periods when you're looking back and then you're pulling things forward saying, oh, this is the perfect example of Greek, Roman, Middle Ages stories, and therefore dragging that into the future by 600, 700, 1,000 years.
That painting is from the Vatican.
Yes, it is, absolutely. So that is a Renaissance painting of looking back at Socrates and Plato. So this has barely anything to do with the Greeks at all, other than the draping of the togas that a Renaissance artist saw in the sculptures left to them. But he basically invented almost everything about the image. So in a way, that's my push to why this background is very important. And thank you for that point. So Xiaoshu, an East Asian definition of a novel. This is translated literally as a small talk and distinguished from a great talk, which is a work of philosophy or history. You can say Plato's dialogues are great talks. Now, small talks depict daily life, real or fictional, and there's no line between memoir and imaginary. Did this actually happen? Is it realistic fiction? Is it fantastic? There's no dividing line between the two. So this small story idea is also found in the roots of Greek theater, and Aristotle's Poetics put it very clearly that tragedy is defined as a tale about important, virtuous characters who meet a bitter end due to an internal flaw. Comedy, on the other hand, is about everyday people, and it must have a happy ending. So therefore, back in the day, comedy, Greek comedy, was romance, must have a happy ending about everyday people. To get back to the Greeks is a third leg to stand on in this case, and that's Herodotus. He was the first historian to weave storytelling into histories. If you've ever sat through a lecture by a very bad college professor who just wants to recite facts and dates at you, you'll understand why Herodotus wanted to add a little flavor to it. So he'd bridge the gap between tragedy's high culture and comedy's low culture by including fanciful accounts, rumors, things about his travels that he had heard that were very much fake, very much wrong. But it made it much more interesting to listen to him reciting, literally 4 hours of, a history of a travel or a war. So these Greek histories were the first written works that really questioned that suspension of disbelief, which in a realistic or a fantastic work have to be there. In Greek comedy and tragedy, there was suspension of disbelief completely. You knew that this was fake. It was silly. It was being performed right in front of you, sometimes by people dressed up as giant birds. And this kind of toes the line of, is there enough credulity to the author that you can suspend your disbelief? Who told these stories? This is rhapsodes, an itinerant group of storytellers who memorized texts and went around talking about them. Plato talked to Ion in one of his dialogues, and he confronted the rhapsode about if his talent in reciting these with very good connecting with his audience and changing things to fit what the context of the situation was, if that was divine inspiration or if that was talent. He, of course, insisted it was talent. Plato insisted it must be divine inspiration. But this becomes the debate of who's putting the story out there. Do publishers who print great works, are they smart or are they just lucky? So rhapsodes, absolutely. This is not where the derivation of the word rapper came from. It has a very different one, but they absolutely were known as singers of stitched lays, which sounds totally like what something Chuck D would have said. Absolutely. So none of the ancient world's works were novels. It has been said sometimes something in the 1st century BC was the first novel. The Odyssey was the first novel. Gilgamesh was the first novel, but they're not set up in the same way. We do not have the contemporary understanding of what makes a novel. Gilgamesh, the earliest story, is still the first fantasy, though. Many Greek comedies were fantasies as well. Sophocles wrote the play Oedipus Rex, an excellent tragedy, just like Breaking Bad. Tragedy still exists today. And True Story by Lucian of Samosata, a Syrian author, was the first science fiction novel. He was absolutely making fun of Herodotus, talking about one-legged humans that lived in the East, and made a story where his characters get on a boat, fly to the moon, fight, I believe, winged humans on Mercury, go all over the place. And it's a satire, but in a way, it was looking at, we know that these heavenly bodies are out there. We're twisting the idea of spiders, making them into monsters, giant ones. And this is science fiction. It absolutely is, but does not fit the context of a novel because he's just describing this in terms of a history. So it's quite dry. Doesn't have really a plot to go through. It's just a series of events. After that, we have 1,000 years of nothing. In the Western canon, everybody says the Dark Ages were so terrible and stuff. And that's just not true. People were still writing stories the entire time. Very little of it survives. So even when you're looking at the ancient Greeks and they say, oh, this is the exemplary part of a Greek tragedy, well, there's only like 7 of them that survive to today. There was probably hundreds, if not thousands of them being performed. So these writers back in the day were lost to time, and the same thing happened every generation subsequently. At the same time, Islam was flourishing. Muslim scholars wrote histories and poetry, did not focus on prose very much, but Arabian Nights and Hayy ibn Yaqzan, I apologize for my pronunciation, are both kind of proto-novels and philosophical texts. They're teaching, and a lot of Christian writing at the time is also telling stories and teaching through that. And that kind of carries through to how we are today, but just kind of lays the groundwork along the way. The culture of Muslim Spain influenced Europeans incredibly. If Spain hadn't been conquered by the Caliphate, then it's very possible that Europe would have been much farther behind in getting to the Renaissance. At the same time, Chinese, Korean, and Japanese, as well as Vietnamese readers, kept the classics, the top of the bestsellers lists. These were all handwritten at the time or done with wood block prints, but it took a long time, and there was not a lot of people. It took a long time to create each one, and there was not a lot of literacy among most people. So in both cases, literacy and free time were the limiting factors that kept reading from exploding. And this comes up later with the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution. People have free time. These languages, oftentimes when you're looking at what's the old stories that everybody's looking at, it has to be translated into a new dialect or only can be read by people who understand dead languages. So that limits the kind of stories that can be read as well. So the creation of the novel, again and again, this is going to loop around as people forget things and come back to it again. Very debatably, the first novel was written in Asia. The Tale of Genji, written by Murasaki Shikibu in the year 1021. I'm sorry if I get that wrong because the box is cutting it off. It's handwritten, passed around. It has many elements of a novel, a central protagonist, well-developed characterization, but it has no plot. It is just a series of events. The story was reproduced concertina style, not as a book. And that means it's basically pages that were folded back and forth like an accordion. And so as you read it, you would kind of flip through it. And that actually is a picture in the top left hand of one of the earlier copies of it. But It was delivered by hand each time a new chapter was written. And it seems to be that this was handwritten and passed down from, one aristocratic lady in Japan to another as the generations passed. So this comes down to us having been reproduced hundreds of times by hand. It's more of a serial fiction. So hat tip to Ian's talk the other day about serial fiction. Here is one of the earliest serial fictions, unless you consider the Odyssey one. There were many long prose stories before and after Murasaki in the East, but don't fit the definition of a novel as we know it today. Now we're going to get to a little bit of the conspiracies, a little bit of the strange things that created them. We're getting out of the background. So who invented the novel? These guys got the ball rolling. They started the Renaissance. Literally 3 dudes in Florence. It wasn't Italy at the time. Bunch of different city-states. So Boccaccio, Dante, and Petrarch, Florentine writers in the 1300s. Dante's Divine Comedy is definitely well known today, but that is a poem. Petrarch also wrote poetry, but they translated a lot of things from the Romans. That's where they got a lot of the ideas for their stories. Boccaccio's Decameron is the most influential at the time. So from Chaucer to Shakespeare, his short stories, his novelettes were widely read, translated, copied, and absolutely ripped off by other authors in Europe at the time. So what's the big explosion? What changes this and makes it so many more people can read? The printing press, as everybody knows, invented in 1440 in Germany. By 1500, printing presses were all over Europe, and it produced more than 20 million volumes. In the 16th century, 150 to 200 million copies. I love this picture in the top left, which is a Korean printing press from earlier. And the idea was you would only ink the letters that you wanted. And as you could spin it, you could stick it to the paper, the one letter that you had inked, pull it off, move it, ink a different letter, start all over again. Not nearly as effective as using movable type, but these kind of things are just piecemeal as it goes through. And although East Asia was very, very ahead of Western thinkers in terms of how to do, multiple copies of printing, at some point this was jumped ahead by the Europeans. So this kind of looking at things leads us to a funny thing today that we don't realize about why it's called that way: uppercase and lowercase. When you had a printing press, and in the top left corner you can see someone setting the letters in there. They do happen to all be uppercase, don't worry about that. The uppercase was because it was farther away from you. As a person was setting up all the letters by looking at a handwritten copy of something and placing them into place, you needed much less of the uppercase. So that was farther away. So your easier boxes to grab are all in the front. Now, as you reach further up, that's the uppercase, and so therefore we call it that. But it's interesting that this letter, this way of describing things is passed down so far. In addition, why are you even using uppercase and lowercase? 2 examples in the top: Chaucer and I do believe Shakespeare, but I could be wrong, where they are capitalizing randomly. But in the first place, capitalization was emphasis, much as we use italics or bold text today. Medieval illustrated manuscripts capitalized only the first, but then the Romantic English writers of the 1700s found teaching texts from the 7th century in England, written by an English teacher who was teaching Latin, which used uppercase and lowercase to demonstrate the different letters, like a little kid where they have the tracing kind of spaces. And they declared that this is how the Romans used to do it. Absolutely not true whatsoever. The Romans wrote in script, and they had larger letters for things like posters, gravestones, signs, and carvings. So there's an entire canon built on, we are going to capitalize this way. Germans capitalize very differently. You can Google that for sure. But it's not used in the same way before this. It's completely different. The reason you capitalize things was put together because of a mistake. So then we have possibly the first novel, Don Quixote. It's not the first novel. It is a satire of chivalric romance stories that were popular in medieval times in Europe. It is a series of events rather than a cohesive narrative. It ends with, and I have found some new pages of Don Quixote's adventures. No ending whatsoever. Cervantes also wrote a lot of straightforward romantics like Persiles and comedies like La Galatea. But also, he had gone to Italy for several years of his life, had read Boccaccio's Decameron, and actually went back to Spain and translated a bunch of those into Spanish. So he was very familiar with kind of this beginning of the cohesive story. Sorry, I didn't really say before that the Decameron is 100 short stories. So that's definitely not a novel, but it is a collection. And this just kind of put together the ideas moving towards a cohesive narrative. So these chivalric romances that Cervantes was writing at the same time as and in the context of were popular throughout the medieval period, featured protagonists who were never in doubt of their triumph. That is, that amazing knight who can slay every dragon he comes across, like Mission Impossible or One Punch Man. And they borrow that ideal protagonist from Greek tragedy. But the necessary happy ending kind of came from Greek comedy. These are things that they read at the time. They still read the Odyssey. They still read some of the old Greek and Roman plays. Don Quixote did reverse this. But like so many other authors, who were satirizing romances, this was absolutely a category at the time. It was a picaresque story. And these were done in short, smaller works known as chapbooks. But just like the serial novels, The Tale of Genji, these were kind of like one chapter at a time put out into the world by printers before being, bound into books potentially later on.
Where did the word picaresque come from?
I don't know that. It's probably just a Latin root, the French vibe to it. And there's probably a definition of someone known as a Picard or a Picard. Good question, though.
All right.
So, in the Middle Ages, romance is fiction. All fiction stories, no matter what they are called romances. So, then we might have the first novel here. 1719, Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe shares many similarities with chivalric romances. He is cast away on an island all by himself, trying to survive. But this is, just one series of events, as it goes, or a series of events that goes on. There's very little plot. It veers into proselytizing Christianity. Let's say this, to a Caribbean Indian who also washes up on the island, that he then becomes his servant. So in a way, a little bit of that Sancho Panza kind of thing from Don Quixote, just someone who looks up to him. And this is the amazing protagonist of this novel. Yeah, like the chivalric romances.
Wait a minute. Why would the guy look up to him? They're on an island. There's just two guys.
Exactly. Yeah. So there's nobody else. Robinson Crusoe has figured out how to live. He knows how to hunt and is adept at figuring out problems. There's I think a thing with pirates, and so him and Friday, which is what he names the unnamed Caribbean Indian who ends up there, end up defeating the pirates. But it's that Robinson Crusoe is just so smart, so amazing. So it owes a large debt to ancient Greek histories. It's kind of a travelogue, just one thing after the next. But is there a reason that this book gets the credits over another and an earlier book? Yes, there is. So I'm gonna plant the flag right here, not on Tale of Genji or on Robinson Crusoe, but the first novel was Orinoco, written by Afra Ben in 1688. So a full 30-some years before Robinson Crusoe. Orinoco is a love story wrapped in a tragedy inside of a history and framed by a narrator who is, writing the story. There's a lot of asides, digressions, and dry descriptive sections, but is immediately recognizable as a novel. So here's my pitch for Hollywood. An African prince, Orinoco, after losing his beloved to a cruel king, the king says, "Oh yes, of course you can marry her," and then decides to take her for himself, is sold into slavery and taken across the sea. His incredible intelligence gives him a special place in the slave colony, and he meets the narrator and impresses her with his wit. He finds that his beloved was sold into slavery. So this is that middle part of the story. You've crashed into a terrible situation, and then the plot changes to a new situation, like the second half of an act. He rescues her from her servitude, and she becomes his wife. After being refused a return to his African kingdom with his new bride, he starts a slave revolt The revolt is brutally put down. This is a bit of a tragedy in the end. Orinoco, at her demand, kills his wife so she won't be tortured by the army before mutilating himself and being killed by soldiers. In the end, and I imagine this scene, like absolutely like it's a movie. The author is writing this book. The narrator, her tail over, sails away. Like she is finishing the last sentence, and then she closes the book and gets on a ship and goes away. This feels like a novel to me. It feels like it has all of the arcs. It has a single cohesive plot that goes through many things that lead. One section comes after the other. It is not a series of plots that starts over again and again, like Friends or Seinfeld. The situation is always the same when you come back to the story. Each one is needed. Each section needs the previous one in order to build the tension and build the plot. Best thing about this, Aphra Behn was a badass, possibly the first professional writer. She wrote letters, she wrote histories, she wrote some yellow journalism, some of those chapbooks. She wrote poetry, plays, translations from French and Latin, and novels. She scrubbed her childhood from the record. Nobody knows what her actual name was. She taught herself to write, self-taught. She lived in Suriname off the South American coast, which is where she got a lot of the descriptions for Orinoco. She faked a dead husband so that she could live without a chaperone in Cromwell's England, where they're very conservative about everything, and was a spy for the deposed king, getting Charles II back in as the King of England. She was a royalist, and her code name was Astrea, which is just fucking awesome. After this, she was absolutely destitute because the king did not pay her, or did not pay her well, debatable in terms of time. So she came back. She was thrown into debtor's prison. She wrote to get herself out of debtor's prison and was writing plays for the King's Company and another theater company, I believe, as well, and achieved fame. Went from literally destitute, being thrown into debtor's prison and threatened with deportation as they did at the time, and got herself out, became a minor celebrity, had affairs with famous people, had political intrigue at the time, was getting involved in things happening in Parliament. She was just an amazing character. I love this. This is like is it Robert Smalls, my character out of the Civil War that is really just a minor story lost to history that is amazing. Google Robert Smalls. It's a great story. So at the time, 1700s, why was it called a novel? Why did we call it today? All these books on the shelf back here that are novels, they're only called that because in the 1700s, they wanted to distinguish it from how a story was written right before then. So it was new. It was novel. It was a novelty, a new kind of writing. So this coining was for fresh prose by authors like Behn and Daniel Defoe, and fell out of favor in the 1800s. So authors like Daniel Hawthorne declined to call their works novels. And they said, no, we write romances. So they used the medieval term for stories of a certain length that had a central protagonist and a plot, but they added in this, section afterwards, characters with flaws that as the main character. By the 1900s, the term novel was back in vogue, and we are here 200 years later saying novels. These are all novel. Whether it's 100 years old, 50 years old, or was printed yesterday, it is still a novel, which is kind of strange and entirely divorced from the reason, that it was originally used, like uppercase, up in the case, or lowercase, low in the case. So in the 19th century, a novel was a romance. They're all romances. So these strange things, this fictional work of a certain length with a main protagonist continued on for 3 centuries. It spawned genres, subgenres, and the vanilla romance and erotica were invented in the 1700s. The early 1800s, Edgar Allan Poe's The Murder in the Rue Morgue started the entire category of mystery novels, which is incredible that Edgar Allan Poe is already awesome. And then on top of that, add some more awesome on top of him if you did not know that. Science fiction began with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Gothic horror started, attributable as well to Frankenstein, but others in the mix as well. Historical fiction started in this time as well. During this Romantic period, Roman stories were rediscovered. They were finally translated from the Latin, were printed, because now you can print and you can distribute them everywhere, including the Satyricon and Ethiopica, which influenced new novels greatly. So this, rediscovery before was of the Greeks and then was of the Romans. So then we get to the Victorian era. It set in motion the structures that become the modern publishing industry. 1700s, 1800s, books were often sold by an author to a publisher as a simple transaction. You hand me a book, I give you money. Done. What the printer does with it is their own business. But during the Victorian era, the first copyrights were written. This was mainly because, in a way, people from other countries would have their books stolen, because if you could get a copy of a book in Russian and then translate it yourself into English, you could sell it all you wanted. And none of the money was going back to either the publisher or the author back in Russia, and vice versa, of course. So this became a system of copyrights. And with that system then became the advance and the royalty system. So at the time, there were 15-20% royalty to the author. That has been eroded over the years down to 6 to 12%. And whatever your advance is, you have to sell a certain amount of books under your royalty structure before you get there. There also was an accounting change, I believe in the 1920s, between the gross sales before discounts of all of your stuff and the net sales. So originally that 15% to 20% was of your gross, even if you gave discounts to large bookstores selling in bulk, etc. And now it is not off of the price, sticker price. It is off of whatever you sold them to. Even if you sold them at an extreme discount to Barnes and Noble, it's at the net rather than the sticker price. So the first literary agent opened shop in 1875. By 1900, they were everywhere. You were first expected to go to a publisher. There was not really a distinction between printers, publishers, and essentially agents. And this broke into 3 different jobs at a certain point. Literary agents made a commission from publishers. I could not find a citation for when that changed. But these days, a literary agent takes 15% from the author's advance and royalties. So these days, a literary agent only makes money if the author makes money. And that's very different from how it was in the original. Before libraries, we all know libraries today as the place you go for free books to borrow. There was the Netflix of libraries, a circulating library, which started off right around 1800 or so, were sometimes focused on certain things. You'd have a science circulating library, you might have a memoir circulating library, but many of them were general. And this new market for literature was voracious for new material. During this Victorian period, there was a lot of censorship, and that kind of split the publishing of books. So there was literary, there was acceptable ones, and there was genre fiction, not as acceptable, but also there were chapbooks. And just like the medieval era, where they were doing these picaresque novels, just kind of making fun of the chivalrous knights in romances, these would be chapbooks that were bawdy, were bloody, were sexy, were scandalous. They would make fun of people who were still alive, who were in power in England, in France, anywhere. And it was just kind of on the edge of legality. They'd pick up everything and move it in the middle of the night. So you can see the little graphic on the side, the illiteracy rate in France, and that goes down, but it really takes a huge drop once you hit the 1800s and gets down to, less than 5% by the turn of the 20th century. So these circulation libraries increased the need for new novels before the rise of public libraries. And because books were very expensive back in the day, these were a way to read books because you were literate, because you wanted entertainment, but could not afford to buy a bunch of books. They were just everywhere. Absolutely. The end of the Victorian, when things start to change, the late 1800s, the beginning of the 1900s, the morality, especially in England and America, dovetailed with the government censorship to encourage the proliferation of morality tales. I can't say actually I was talking about the end, but it's the entire century. They reinforce conservative social values. These stories live on today in the expectation that the protagonist will learn something about themselves. It's not just the external world. It's not just the dragon that you're defeating, and therefore you affect change and save the princess. No, you learn about something You learn something about yourself along the way. So this Victorian is still in our novels today. So in pursuit of a virtuous protagonist at the end of a book, Victorian novels reinforce the concept of the climax, as these external victories reflected internal changes, but that does reinforce the third act. The end of a novel really set in terms of being important in the Victorian period. And it was partially because of this morality situation. So we get into the 20th century, and that morality is just blown out the door, because everybody's able to get whatever they want. Talk about those chapbooks before and printers who would pick up and move in the middle of the night. No, they can just print pulp novels now. With advances in technology and machinery, they became massively cheaper. It became popular in different languages all over the world. Suddenly there is printed material where before there was not. Communication became incredibly fast. Newspapers exploded. So the combination of cheap paper, because you had to print newspapers incredibly fast and get them out and as easily as possible, and the illustrated book cover invented to help sell books, they came together, and that created the paperback and the pulp novel. I've done this a few times with paperbacks, but it's really more the thing from from the 1940s, from the 1960s. If anybody was a teenager back in the day, I'm just going to hold this, which is a odd thing, but you would have paperback and it would fit in your back pocket. And this was something that was in a way disposable. Yes, you might get a few reads out of it. You might be able to hand it on to your friend, but really the edges frayed. It totally got destroyed. And you were happy if you got to the end of the book and the spine didn't break. But this was a very different way of thinking about books, as opposed to hardcovers that have to stay at home, or you have to be in a setting where you can either carry something or you can, put it down. So that really changed the meaning of the novel. And these pulp novels just absolutely blew up. But the bifurcation of the Enlightenment, when they said these are acceptable novels and these are not, filtered through the Victorian.
Can I add something that I thought was really cool when I found out about it?
Yes.
The thing you're talking about, them falling apart, that is a feature, not a bug. That's one of the things that books were provided to soldiers in World War I and World War II, but they knew that they were going to be handed around in sections. Essentially, like you rip the book apart and it's like, do you have chapter 2 and 3? Okay, yeah, I've got 4 and 5. Okay. And you would move around. So there was like intentionality of making a binding that could be broken, because then you could spread the stories and the leisure around to more of the troops when the books got sent over, versus having one book that one guy got to have.
Let me bring up another World War II one as well that doesn't have to do with books, but sounds like that in terms of production, which was the Soviet Union in 1942 realized that any tank that went onto the field and was in battle lasted for about 15 hours. So instead of, like the Germans did, create incredibly perfect machine parts that would last for, 500 days, they created the cheapest possible parts that they could, because they knew the average one would not last more than 15 hours. So if you're printing these paperbacks and you're like, hey, none of these, are going to last more than, 3 weeks out there, well, just use the cheapest glue you possibly can and don't worry about it. But thank you for that, Shannon. Heck yeah. So in this case, as you're splitting between high literature and genre fiction, you get to the 1920s and 1930s, you start to get libraries coming about, and these, in the first place, are not a gathering place for everybody. It is a place where everybody is able to come and learn what the elites of England, France, America, etc., believe is the right kind of reading. At the same time, literary awards really grow up, and those are all set up by people like the Rockefellers and the Carnegies and stuff, and a way to award the books that they believe are important. And so for all the times people are thinking about what's my, like such and such won an award, well, that's just really getting the stamp of approval from the 1%. And that's terribly interesting to think that literary awards are not given away most of the time by governments or community organizations. No, they're given away by people who have decided we're going to help self-support what we believe in culture is the right thing that people should be reading. So we move on from that kind of idea. Please. Yes?
On what basis did they decide? What were they looking for?
Yes, I will get to that once we start talking about the Iowa Writers Workshop for sure. You could say Flannery O'Connor and William Faulkner were among it. And so it's like realism. They want realism. They want people who have these kind of morality questions. Before we get to that, let's talk about libraries. And Anne Carroll Moore was a librarian for the New York Public Library who championed children's literature. She absolutely changed it from children don't read, no big deal. They should be going, getting their lessons from school, but they should not be enjoying reading. They can enjoy reading when they grow up.
What?
To actively trying to get children to read. And this goes to the original intent of libraries, but it also was her personal idea and her goal in life. This is the 1920s, 1930s. She's like, children should be reading. She invented the category of young adult. So as opposed to most of the other ones, which came from an author creating something that was new and novel and became a genre as people made similar things, she declared this is a category of literature. Yes,
Louisa May Alcott.
Louisa May Alcott, yes.
And she originally was writing horror stories, but she found her niche writing stories for young adults or teenagers. Children.
Yeah. So what Anne Carroll Moore did was look at the books that were out there and be like, these are acceptable for teenagers, for young adults. And so she dragged some books out of adult literature and declared that there is a new category, young adults. And it still survives today and is one of the most popular types of literature, as well as 50-some% of people who read YA books are adults. So it's interesting where it kind of toes the line. But while Moore had certainly had a positive effect on literature, she was vindictive and opinionated. She worked tirelessly for the books she liked, but she attacked ones that she did not. She famously tried to spike the book Stuart Little by E.B. White. She said it would ruin his career. She tried to stop him from publishing it by sending letters to his publisher. She threatened columnists who considered reviewing it. But E.B. White's wife wrote for the New Yorker and got the New Yorker to review it, breaking Anne Carroll Moore's boycott. And she tried to organize a library boycott of Stuart Little. But at this point, there was lots more to bookstores. Libraries, circulating libraries, did not control the majority of the book buying public. But for a bit, when Anne Carroll Moore could bless your book and therefore it got super popular, libraries held a lot more sway than they did today. But Moore felt that White's mixing of realistic and fantastic elements would damage children's minds, echoing Victorian morality and the idea that, kids can only handle certain things and they shouldn't be exposed to X, Y, and Z. Now we get to a conspiracy. This is a real conspiracy. In the mid-20th century, the Cold War set the U.S. against the Soviet Union. Soviets established and championed socialist realism. You need to emphasize low-caste protagonists triumphing over adversity, and the U.S. wanted to fight that. In art, they championed things like abstract expressionism. They specifically got a hold of a bunch of paintings by Jackson Pollock and put them on a tour of the world to show how amazing and creative American artists were at the time that socialist realism was paintings of, landscapes that could have been done 200 years before that, before the invention of Impressionism and Modernism and Cubism. So in writing, they tipped the scales, and they had help of Paul Engel, who ran the Iowa Writers Workshop, and he received thousands and thousands of dollars from the CIA in order to promote something that was different than socialist realism. The ways that they did that was, of course, very hush-hush, the Congress for Cultural Freedom, the Asia Foundation, and private organizations run by 1%, once again, that were pushing things that were basically behind what would exalt capitalism and would say that America is the best, like the Rockefeller Foundation again. He said there was only two types of fiction that are acceptable: highbrow, metaphorical realism, and magical realism. Every other type of story structure was denied entry to the canon. You are not getting accepted to the Iowa Writers Workshop if you are writing anything other than those two things. So more than 70 creative writing MFA programs in this country were started by Iowa Workshop alums. They put them through the meat grinder, found exactly what they wanted, and pushed it back all the way across the country. Alumni also helm major publishing companies and regularly win prestigious awards for their novels. Guggenheim Fellowships, 5 Guggenheim Fellowships were given to Iowa Workshop graduating class in 2017. So this is still today. You go through the meat grinder and you come out and you're acceptable to everybody. The dictums of Angle, meaning, sense, and clarity in that order became what publishers wanted to publish, what award panelists wanted to honor, and what authors wanted to write. This is how you achieve success. Okay, good, I need to write this. Iowa Workshop method of critique, where an author sits in the center of a group, has to stay quiet while they're told the positives and negatives of the story they have submitted, has drawn much criticism in the past decade as the reason for why, and the reason for why we adhere to this system is starting to be questioned. But it's just the way it's always been is not really a good answer. The Iowa method is now criticized as an unnecessary and even cruel method of critique, which has driven many authors, especially marginalized communities, out of writing. If you're going to sit there and face the firing squad, you have to be very confident in yourself. As I like to say when people question, can I really do this? I love to say, can you have the confidence of a cis white man in America? Stand there, do it. So
wait a minute. I read somewhere years ago that there were 2 groups of college students, one male and one female, that gathered together and had critiquing groups. And the female group encouraged their writers, and the male group discouraged their writers, and the female group members became famous writers, and the male writers disappeared.
Well, I'm very glad for them, and that is awesome that it ended up that way. I would need more details to know what the situation was. But yeah, and if you have a mixed group, let's say in 1962, it was 70% male and 30% female, and the men are disparaging everybody who's right in front of them. That's not going to make you want to continue writing, even if 30% of the room is telling you, great story. I got about 5 minutes left right here. I'm going to run through a little bit of Joseph Campbell. He's been very influential to our current writing scene. The hero's journey is the template with every Western genre story, almost to a T. He researched tons of folk tales as an anthropologist and led him to the theory of the monomyth, that all folk tales can be boiled down to a single story. He became a celebrity. His book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, and many others became bestsellers, and many writers' guides these days have adapted his theories. Unfortunately, his research methods were not very good as far as scientific inquiry goes. And Anna, if I can ask you, being the resident scientist I know that's here, why is it bad to have a hypothesis and then cherry pick your answers to fit your hypothesis?
Well, that gives you a selection bias.
That's the word I didn't know.
But also, which I did want to mention, because you may be about to mention this, but you haven't mentioned it yet. His ideas became very popular in psychology as well. People using the hero with a thousand faces to, figure out what kind of, psychology, what kind of like brain type they had and things like that. And so, but yes, he created a selection bias in his own research by cherry picking.
Star Wars copies that journey, right?
Yes.
It's designed to.
Yeah, that's actually sorry, Sean. That's when he became popular. His ideas became popular in Hollywood when George Lucas said that Star Wars was inspired by the hero's journey.
So you had many different story structures, leading up to here. You had all the different romances, different ways of building stories. And he said, never mind, there is one story. That's it. So I'm not exactly going to talk about that, Anna, but on the edge of it for sure, his impact in psychology. But Campbell's politics have come into question since his death in 1989, with new attention being paid to his Nazi sympathies during and after World War II, anti-Semitism, and anti-Black attitudes in both correspondence as a professor for at Sarah Lawrence College. Interviews show him railing against women's rights, and his hero's journey excludes women completely from participating as a hero. Now, this in a way is those romances from the Middle Ages where you would have the hero knights who would go out and triumph over adversity, but that's not the only story, nor the only story being told, even at the time. His belief, and this is psychological, in the psychic unity of all mankind kind of rings hollow when his theories adhere to rigorous gender norms, subsisting all world cultures to Western ideas. And the fact that his monomyth echoes the Protestant work ethic of pull yourself up by your bootstraps, which, by the way, is another one of those apocryphal things, because the joke is if you grab your bootstraps, your shoelaces, and you pull yourself into the air, you don't move. So the whole thing of pulling up your bootstraps, it's a joke on being impossible. For good or ill, the hero's journey has taken over popular media. As you said, in movies, absolutely, AP. It puts together the protagonist with a flaw from Greek tragedy, the need for a happy ending from Greek tragedy, from Greek comedy, the moral and physical crisis of Victoria fiction, and the inward gaze of the Iowa workshop. So this all kind of came together, and we are looking at 50 years of this all being a mashup of all these years of things. Maybe we can get out of it. The thing is, getting out of it is going to be difficult when publishing is just so white. So, in 2021, Shelley Romero, who has come on Writer's Lunch before, and Adriana Figueroa updated a scathing article about the publishing industry from 1995 titled The Unbearable Whiteness of Publishing. In the 25 years between one article and the next, incremental but small change has happened. Straight white women dominate the industry. Straight white men take up the majority of the rest. In a time when post-George Floyd protests all over the U.S. and corporations going out and saying we're going to open up everything to diversity, they had really very, very small changes happening. And so to come out and say it as it's happening is super important. And then on top of that, within the past 2 years since this article came out, many of the people hired in the meantime have left, both because of incredible stresses put onto them by the industry, but also because they do not pay. It is impossible to live in Manhattan and work as an editorial assistant without monetary support from a parent or partner. So while Shelley found that 2% of editorial professionals, including herself, were Hispanic, 19% of the country today is. I didn't find in my research any nepotism. I could find all sorts of nepo babies in Hollywood for sure, but in authors and publishing, not so much. But the economic structure of publishing means that only already wealthy individuals can work in the industry. Publishing will continue to reflect the demographics of the rich only in America, as long as publishing does not pay a living wage for where they are having to live in the country. My last little conspiracy, and I do hope it ties some things together, this disparagement of romances as old as Plato railed against comedies is not important versus the more serious tragedies. Throughout history, novels and romances have been synonymous with small stories and everyday people, but every era has looked back at the previous to pick out their classics, declaring new fiction as less than worthy. Orinoco by Afroben was buried by Victorian critics because they said it was vulgar, and they said the author was scandalous, and it was wiped from history. Now they said that a man who espoused Christian morality and taught it to a man who washed up half dead on his deserted island was the original novel. So romance books today, which have been their own genre for 100 years, are seen as the lowest form of writing. But at the same time, half of all books sold are romances. If you're looking for prestige and winning awards, why are you looking for that when you want people to read your books? It's important for all of us to read romances. It is part of the canon. It is one of the most important bits of writing forever. So a half of all novels today are romances. That's all I got. Now, I've seen the chat going off for sure, and I'm sorry I did not get to any questions. I hope they're hilarious comments. But please, anybody who wants to have comments on it would love it. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, Sean. That was really great.
I read 2 romance novels in the past month based on an interview, because this romance writer is from Houston and set her novels in Houston. I can't remember her name. One of them is called What You Wish For.
Yeah.
I can't remember the name of the author. I forgot the name of the other novel also. But anyway, They were okay.
even if you don't like it. It is.
One of them was good, and the other one was okay.
It's just, it's such an important part. If you were to say, I don't know, I'm going to go on sports things because the NFL is about to start. If you were to say, I only care about NFC teams because they are the best, and then go on to watch an entire season of football and then have them lose in the Super Bowl to the other half of the football league, which is the AFC, you would be very upset. But you have to pay attention to the other side. There's a full half of all of writing. So you have to pay attention to romances. The whole idea of, oh no, I don't do that, is absolutely disingenuous.
Is the novel I'm writing a romance? It's about a married couple, but they have a quarrel and it has to get resolved at the end.
So the two requirements for something to be a romance novel is that it has to have a central love story. So their relationship needs to be the center of it, and it needs to have a happy ending. So either happily ever after or happily for now. So if your book ends with them getting into like drama, maybe, as opposed to romance, but if it does end with them reconciling, it would be considered a romance.
I asked my wife what these two gigantic white bags were in her closet, and I thought they were some kind of garbage. She goes, no, those are all of the romance books I've read in the last 6 months. Gigantic white bags.
Which is part of the reason why romances are a full half of a novel sold, is because romance readers read voraciously. And so it's like the difference between median and average. If the median American reads 1.3 books a year, the average American reads 7 books a year, because there are romance readers who are reading 70.
Because they'll read 7 books in a week.
Yeah.
Yeah, you sit down to read one of those and you're going to finish it in maybe the same day or the next day.
It depends.
They read fast.
It's
and
written,
you can't put them down.
It's written that way, and it just has to be a part of how you're digesting, the idea of writing a novel.
So Emily in the chat says romance readers are often whale readers, and I am imagining what I think this term means, and someone might need to correct me, but what I think this term means is like when whales feed, right? They just open their mouths wide and just like swallow a whole school of fish all at once. Yeah, inhaling books is what she says in the chat.
Catherine Centers, I think it is.
Yeah, I went to go look it up, and she is a local Houston author. Her Amazon page, her Goodreads page shows a bunch of stuff in Houston, like Blue Willow. She apparently had something going on at the River Oaks Theater, which is really cute. We went, yay, it's Catherine Center inside of like the marquee for her. She looks like she writes some adorable stuff. That one you're talking about is about a librarian and a principal that form a relationship.
Yes.
So I don't know how realistic it is now with them closing all the libraries, but that's a different conversation. It looks cute. I do want to say that.
So this is one thing I do want to say, and this goes back to Cervantes and Don Quixote, that if you're looking at romance and you're a cynical sort and you write something to satirize that romance, that's perfectly fine. That's the other half of the canon in a way. But the interplay between them is absolutely necessary. So you can't advance, literature on the cynical satire side without advances in romance, and vice versa. It's just this, two sides of a coin flipping back and forth.
Now, what did you say? Either it's a romance, or if it's a sad ending, it's a what?
A tragedy. That would be a tragedy.
No, she used a
the
different
tragedies
word.
are extremely rare.
I said that it would be considered contemporary fiction or a drama.
Drama.
In terms of modern genre convention.
Marketing, yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, and
thank you.
This is the thing: is you don't have to shoehorn yourself into saying this is a romance novel. I'm just saying you always have to learn from it. If it does not fit the definition that a romance reader is going to exactly be looking for, put yourself out in a different category, because they're very specific about the types of stories they want, that central romance. But it is important to learn from romance, is what I mean to say. So Emily says romantic tragedy, absolutely a thing. Romeo and Juliet, which is a Shakespeare story that was pretty much stolen from Boccaccio
Star-crossed lovers.
in Italy in the 13th century.
Why not? Must.
Well, cool. It is just after 2. And Shannon, do you want to remind us about how you're going to poison us all next week?
Yeah. I am going to be talking about, for those of you who aren't here, authors pick your poisons. We'll be talking about common poisons in literature, as well as uncommon ones, how to choose the correct poison for what your plot needs, whether it's to get the poisoner caught or get them to escape note. We'll talk about genre fiction and realistic fiction. So it'll be a pretty packed day. I look forward to seeing you guys there. I went ahead and put the link to the Eventbrite into the chat for you guys. But if you enjoyed this one, please go follow us on Eventbrite so that you can see more of Sean's really, 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 really good, well-researched
I had
events.
so many extra slides. I didn't even get into dingbats, which is this strange font that you'll always find, in Microsoft Word. There's a reason for it, but yeah.
I don't know if we can fill a full hour with wingding, so maybe you can do a part 2.
See, somebody is referring to a Lady Sherlock series. There's a whole lot of women writers who were doing thrillers, murder mysteries that feature a cat.
Heck yeah.
I mean, it's a
That
whole
is-
genre in itself. There's many different authors that have this cat or that cat in their
Yes.
stories.
I totally would. Absolutely.
Are there any about dogs?
Oh, I doubt it. No. Nobody needs books about dogs.
Well,
He's being
it's always
busy.
good to have a dog companion for your protagonist. I have one in my current book called Sherlock, and he can tell people are lying or not. So see if that works out.
That sounds interesting.
All right, guys, any last questions for Sean before we go?
Fabulous job, Sean. Really, really
Thank
good.
you. Fabulous information.
I hope you have some strange things that you can bring up at dinner conversation anytime. Yes. Heck yeah.
Have we ever had a discussion with having a doctor come on or someone with medical knowledge to talk about killing people and beating and what it takes to shoot somebody and kill them? Things like
Yes, that would be me.
Okay.
I can do a rehash next month since you
Okay.
brought it up. I think the last time I did it was about a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago.
Oh no,
Who
that
was
was a
that,
while.
Suki?
That was a while ago. That was
It
in
was
the
a longer?
depths of 2020.
Okay.
Yeah.
What's your
Yeah,
name?
so my name is Shannon Winton. One
Okay,
part of my
Shannon.
background is as a trauma ICU nurse, as well as an
There you go.
ER.
Perfect.
I've run a couple of workshops here in Houston, like over a decade ago now, where we essentially attacked a pig so that people could understand what it actually felt like to attack another being. The pig was dead, do not worry. It was a
carcass. Yes.
roasting pig, not a live pig. To get an idea of the heft of common weaponry and as well as the impulse weapons to see what would do damage and what would not. So I do have a long history of doing bonkers medical stuff. There will not be a hands-on portion, but yeah, next month I can go ahead and rehash some medical concepts in fiction.
Oh,
That was great.
How
That's
to
great.
kill with your writing. I'm just guessing a title already.
All right, guys, I will go ahead and close this off. Hopefully, if you have any other questions for Sean, you can grab him off Facebook, and I'm sure he would be happy to answer. And yeah, we'll see you next week. Bye, everybody.
thank you.
Bye.